Okay, continuing with our discussion of push factors that surrounded English migration in the 1600s. All right, so we discussed A, escape from religious persecution, and C, commercialism, that is the desire to make profit, right? We skipped B because it involves a little more lengthy discussion. It's actually quite complicated, and specifically involves that transition from feudalism to capitalism. Okay, and I've talked about this in the past in a previous discussion, I believe, in previous topic actually. But what's happening in Europe, and of course that includes England, is exactly that. This transition from the medieval era or period to the modern period. So we have this very specific period called the early modern period, which is sort of this period sandwiched in between both periods, right? And when we look at that, historically, we see there are features of both, medievalism hanging around, medieval outlooks, medieval beliefs, right? Superstition, supernatural. But we also see the beginning of things like science and early capitalism, beginning of democracy, all the things that we think of as past feudalism and more modern, right? So, this is what's happening here. And there's again, economic underpinning to B, okay, that relates to that historical transition. And let me remind you that, when we think economically of that transition, we're really talking about feudalism to capitalism, early capitalism again. All right. So B starts off with urban social problems, right? So, at first this may seem confusing. How could urban social problems be involved in push factors? Well, let me leap a few slides ahead, actually, okay, to this right here. Just ignore the meaning of land for now. Of course, we're going to discuss it soon, but for now, I just want you to look at this layout here, okay? And it depicts what was probably a typical, clearing and layout of a settlement in feudal England. You see here the king, or if it wasn't the king, I'm sure it was the lord, right? You see nobility and aristocracy in the form of earls and barons, right? And then you see what's equivalent to the army back then or military, which is knights. And then you see the ordinary people. And they are in this picture, which I think is quite accurate, right? They are settled in the outskirts, on the margins of this small settlement. Okay? And this is deliberate. The way this is laid out is according to the feudal social worldview and political worldview. Now, let me start by saying this. Socially or politically, feudalism, or let's just say medieval social structure, is very fixed, it's very rigid and hierarchical. There's a hierarchy here. And you could probably guess the way it's ordered, right? You have the king, in this case, the very top. Right below him are lords or nobility, as I used the term earlier, earls and barons and those folks. And then you have probably the priests, right below them, and then knights, the military. And then you're getting to the bottom of this hierarchy. And you have the lowly peasants, and then right below them are slaves. Okay, now, there's a lot of categories in the feudal worldview, or the feudal social arrangement, rather. So I have to emphasize again how it's rigid. If you are born a peasant, you will die a peasant. There's no such thing as upward social mobility. Something in today's world is, in our country, we talk about, moving up, right? In fact, many of you might be going to college because you have professional aspirations. You need your degree to move up, right? Moving up in terms of social rank or economic rank is just a reality. But back then, it was not a reality. Okay, if you're born in the noble class, you will die as a noble person. All right. So in this layout, the peasants are relegated to the margins here, to the outskirts of society. Now, here's the thing. Um, During the medieval period, as the periods before it, it's profoundly agrarian, absolutely agrarian. This is before the Industrial Revolution, and it's before the pervasiveness of the market economy that characterizes early capitalism. And if it's profoundly agrarian, you need the land. Land is central. It's really the sum and substance, to use an expression, of medieval life, or any, period actually before capitalism, right? Because that's how people survived. You cultivated the land ever since the agricultural revolution, that is, 10,000 BCE, right? All that time moving forward until this time we're talking about, that is to say, the medieval period. You see land as being central, right? So when it comes to peasants, there was nothing illegal, there was nothing prohibited, it was not controversial at all that they settled the land. All right. So this brings us to the idea of land ownership, quote unquote. When it comes to the medieval period, does someone own the land? Are there land owners per se, as we understand it today? Right? If you own land today, you are a property owner. Well, back then, the way you thought of land ownership was not in the same sense as we think of it today. Today, we think of it as, it's our land. In fact, we should enclose it, set up a fence, right, or a gate or whatever. We could put up a sign that says, no trespassing, right? We could certainly charge someone with a crime of trespassing if they, violate your private property, right? They trespass. Well, back then it wasn't like that. In fact, that's why you have the peasants able to squat on those land. So going back to the question, was there any land ownership? The answer is, again, not the way we have it today. You talked about things like a person or a lord who had title to the land or who controlled the land, but it was not closed off. And it was pretty much assumed by any person. And again, let's remember it's agrarianism, right? You have to use the land to survive for your own subsistence. You have to farm, right? Okay, so it's nothing controversial about selling that land. The Lord is going to, generally accept this fact, right? In fact, they just take its tradition. They don't question it. That doesn't mean they squat for free. The word there is squatting when you settle, even though you don't have, quote, title to the land, okay? You do have to pay a tax to settle, or to squat that land. It could be in the form of, part of your cultivation. It could be in the form of serving in the army if the Lord goes to war with another rival. It could be in the way of a corvée. Corvée means for, labor as tax. They'll say, okay, you can settle this land, but you have to work for me for this amount of time, right? Okay, so that's various ways to squat the land if you're the, quote, lowly peasant, unquote, right? Now, if you were a peasant, if you're born into the peasant class, most likely, especially those at the bottom of the peasant class, because even peasantry admitted to degrees, believe it or not. But if you're the very lowest of the peasants, your life was pretty miserable, okay? But at least you're able to survive and use the land. Okay, so that's the deal there in terms of the medieval, or let me be more specific, the feudal arrangement here that we see depicted in this illustration. Now, I just mentioned something earlier, at the beginning of this slide or this video, that what we see happening during the 1600s, and it actually starts the century before in the 1500s, is this movement whereby these people who controlled the land or had title to the land in a feudal sense begin to close it off and to begin to consider it as private property. Why? Because you see the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And in capitalism, it was felt you needed to have such a thing as private property, right? To enclose the land and to keep people out of your private property. So how did it work in England? Well, it worked like this. This is a common sort of scenario happening in England. At the time, the textile export industry, to use that word industry loosely, let's just call it textile business, was, in the early stages of capitalism, highly profitable. So that meant that these lords who, quote, dominated the land, they said, you know what, we could play the game of capitalism too, and we could make a lot of money just by trading for this wool and ultimately getting profit. So what they began doing in England, in places like we see there before us in that slide, is they begin to enclose the land. Well, it has a dual purpose, right? Number one, you want to keep the sheep, which is the source of your wool, right? You want to keep them from escaping, because the more sheep you have, the more wool you have, and therefore the more profit you potentially have. But it's also serves a purpose in keeping people off the land, because the more land you have that you could use for grazing sheep, for example, the more profit you can make. And it doesn't compare eventually, especially as capitalism develops, it doesn't compare to that tax that the peasant is paying. So you'd rather have your wool industry rather than peasant settlement in the land you control. So what you start doing is enclosing. And what does enclosure mean? It means, and by the way, there's a slide on this. Let me see. I'm sorry. Here it is. Role of enclosure. You see the lords beginning to enclose the land, meaning you put up fences so these peasants could no longer squat the land. Okay, so that's the well-known episode in the history of capitalism in modern times, where you see Europe, in this case, leaving behind that medieval patterns, economic, social patterns, and slowly but surely becoming more modern. And in this specific case, we're leaving behind feudalism, and it's becoming more capitalist, right? Because of the profit involved in this case, the wool business. Okay, so the question is here, what happens to all those peasants? So this is going to lead us to back to our discussion of push factors. Okay, as you can imagine, they may try to go to another, or seek other land that's available, right? But what's going to happen there is, if you own land, so to speak, you want to enclose it too, because you hear about other people enclosing their land and making profit. So similarly, you see that happening all over the place, to the point where the dislocated peasants began to flock to the city. And here we have the term urban. Okay, you see migration from rural to urban. Now, once they settle in the urban areas, and here we're talking about this precipitous influx, right? Meaning sudden and explosive, really. Influx of people moving to the city, it's going to cause social problems. Things that, we may be aware of in the city today, right? Whenever you see overcrowding. You may see today slums, crime, vice, uh, social problems like children, uh, you know, unsupervised, running around, so on and so forth. Okay, so this happens in the urban setting, let's say London. Okay, so how is this involved as a push factor? And by the way, this takes us to this interesting case called Malthusian conditions. So let me talk about this here. Now, Malthus was a social scientist who actually was doing his academic work pretty much after this thing we're talking about now, the English outmigration to the New World. I believe he's writing in the late 1700s and early 1800s. But what he's looking at is the development of the modern city, let's say Paris or other cities around in Europe, during the 1800s, and especially the early stages of industrialization, right? Because what's happening at that time is exactly what I talked about. You see immigrants coming into the modern city, and it's causing all these problems, right? So Malthus is looking into it, and he comes up with his Malthusian theory, which is still talked about today, by the way. All right. Here is what's happening in his model. And by the way, this is called a structural explanation here of what happens when two episodes or two conditions are coexisting within this finite area. In this case, the finite area is known as the city. Okay. Structural, by the way, means that this happens regardless of human decision making. There are prior background conditions that actually cause things to happen almost or seemingly inevitably. Okay. All right. So in Malthus's case, in his theory, let's say you have on this the axis of food output, but also population at the same time, and then of course you have time here in the bottom. So what Malthus is referring to in terms of population is, of course, this. You see here a sudden and astronomical, really, probably the better term to use is exponential, because it's more math, right? Exponential climb in population, compared to this era, this period, you have boom, sudden climb. Now, similarly, or rather alongside this climb, you have food supply. And, you can use food or just in general means of subsistence, right? You have here a case where food or your means of subsistence is still climbing, right? Because of need. But the fact is that in this condition, the population climbs too much. It outpaces the food supply drastically. So what should happen according to Malthusian theory should these two conditions obtain? That is to say, the condition of drastic rise in population amid food, a food production, but that can't compete with population climb, right? Well, should be pretty obvious. What's going to happen is the excess population within that area, that finite area, is going to be, if you will, structurally speaking, squeezed out. Now, that immigrant might say, "Oh, I'm going to leave. I can't find a job. I can't feed myself. I'm leaving tomorrow. I've made my decision." Well, was it really a decision you made, or was that decision conditioned by these background conditions that we call Malthusian, right? Interesting explanation that Malthus is saying here. It's a structural explanation that's sort of, it's interrogating this idea of free will, right, or decision making when it comes to immigration. Again, the conditions have to be in place, though. All right, so what's happening is in the city of London during the 1600s, you have Malthusian conditions in place. Excuse me, sorry about that. That's what's happening. So now it's going to involve some um, policies that are begin to arrive here in England. Okay, and here's the thing: I mentioned that yeah, in the New World became more stable, but it was still fraught with danger. Right, a typical person in England might not want to go to the New World. They've heard about Indians there. They've heard about the dangers. They've heard about this terra incognita, again, uncharted territory. Do you really want to take a chance, right? The typical English person. Well, who would typically want to take a chance? It'd be probably these people who are immersed directly in these Malthusian conditions, immersed in that poverty and overcrowding and social problems. Okay, so here's the thing: an actual policy came up in order to entice settlers. What they want to do is, just like the Spanish example with miscegenation, if you recall, the English officials, even though it's not centralized like Spain, but various English groups, whether it's commercial groups or what have you. In this case, we're talking about the Virginia Company. They want to entice more English people to settle. So they come up with something called the head right system. Okay, the head right system. And here's what the head right system refers to. It guarantees 50 acres of free land in Virginia, the Virginia colony, for every English person that decides to settle there. So let's say you have a man and he brings his wife and two kids. Well, that's automatically 50 acres per person. That's therefore 200 acres. All right. So that sounds good. But here's the thing: you could afford the voyage. As I mentioned, it's an expensive thing to go to the New World. It costs a lot of money. But you can afford it if you want to take advantage of the headright system and, try to find profit in the New World. And by the way, many of these guys would go on to put up or set up plantations, right? Become super wealthy. So it was a good decision they made, right? To go to the New World. But going back to the idea of, who's going to do all the work? Certainly not the wealthy person. Okay. What he is probably able to do is, because of his above average wealth, if not being wealthy, very wealthy, he is able to hire, if you will, slaves. Okay. And the term for this is indentured servants. Okay. Indentured servants. And the practice itself is referred to as indentured servitude. Now, here's the thing about indentured servitude. It involves a master and a slave, and the slave enters it willingly. It's not by force, but by volition or free will. Okay? It involves a contract, and it's not perpetual slavery. Rather, it involves 4 to 7 years, depending on the contract. So what's happening with indentured servitude is the slave willingly, or would-be slave, soon-to-be slave, right? Or let's just call it the poor person, amid these Malthusian conditions, willingly signs a contract to put himself or herself. There were, about a quarter of the servants in Virginia were women. Okay, they decide to put themselves in this condition of servitude, but it's only temporary. It's, 4 to 7 years. They have to survive their tenure. But why would they sign that contract besides Malthusian conditions, right? Well, here's the thing. If they decide to do it, they will find themselves in the New World. And, there's no way as a peasant or former peasant, now dispossessed and mired in these Malthusian conditions, there's no way that they would be able to afford it on their own. In fact, it's an impossible dream. They heard of all this land, right? This vacant land in the New World. Well, that's just a dream. There's no way it could happen. But guess what? If you survive in Virginia as an indentured servant, and then you're given your freedom after that, are you going to return home to England? No, you're going to stay in the New World. and try to stake your claim. That doesn't guarantee that all former indentured servants, once they finish their contract, will get free land. Not at all. That won't be the case. Okay, but the possibility does exist. All right, so going back to Malthusian conditions, those people who willingly sign the contract to enter themselves into indentured servitude, especially in this case with the Virginia Company, right, through the headright system again, right, are those people who are, a lot of them were former peasants, who were kicked off the land due to the enclosure. They found themselves in an urban setting, and amid these social problems, they're seeking a way to find relief from it, right? They're, in a way, to use my earlier term, squeezed out. Well, guess what? They're going to become the indentured servants. So again, should be noticeable here that the central category of labor looms large here, right? And that's true whether today in the, say Qualcomm hiring labor from India, right? Indian engineers, right? Or back then, the earliest settlements of English in the New World, right? Labor. Needless to say, that's going to apply with African labor, namely slavery. But in distinction to indentured servitude, African labor will be perpetual, and we'll talk about that very soon. Okay, so that's the letter B, which is, again, it took up about half an hour of our time, but it's important to understand the context here, historical context, the demographic context, right? Transition from feudalism to capitalism. And, let me say this, that once the indentured servant survives and finds himself or herself the new world, there's no feudalism there. Okay? They could die someone who's actually, remember I said, you're born a peasant, you die peasant. Well, not if you're not in the new world. Not if you're in the new world. You arrive as a peasant, but guess what? You may be a landowner when your life ends. So there you go. The possibility enough, that possibility enough was enticement or inducement, sufficient inducement to take a chance in indentured servitude. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about pull factors in the next video.